What Admiral Ernest King was reading seemed unbelievable. Awakened from his slumber was the graying 63-year-old head of U.S. Navy operations. Early on the morning of August 12, 1942, his headquarters received a long overdue telegram from the Guadalcanal war zone. 3 days had passed since the USS Astoria was sunk. Captain George Russell showed King the memo and remarked simply, "It isn't good." Off Savo Island, close to Guadalcanal, there had been a naval combat. A Japanese naval force had ambushed the American warships defending the landing zone approaches on the island's beaches at night. They had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers. No damage was done to the surrounding troop transports, which were still unloading valuable supplies. On the other hand, the danger of further strikes was drawing them back. King would eventually view the Battle of Savo Island as the war's low point. "That was the darkest day of the war, in my opinion," he stated. The entire future suddenly became uncertain. The USS Astoria, CA-34, the final of the 4 cruisers to sink, was the last to do so. You may read more about the Pacific Theater and Guadalcanal events in W2 History magazine. The United States of America's history. The Astoria, the second vessel in the New Orleans class of heavy cruisers, was launched on December 16, 1933, at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. The New Orleans class focused on protection and was one of the final cruisers built to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The New Orleans ships were marginally smaller than earlier treaty cruiser types, but they had stronger deck armor, thicker belts of side armor, and more protection around the magazine rooms. 9 8-inch cannons positioned in 3 turrets made up the main battery of the Astoria. 8 machine guns and 8 5-inch single-mount guns, arranged roughly amidships, 4 to a side, made up the secondary armament. A variety of anti-aircraft guns were added during the war and placed at different locations around the ship. Before taking part in the Guadalcanal mission, the Astoria was no stranger to action. She started the war on a mission to deliver planes to Midway Island while traveling with the carrier Lexington. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the task force was situated around 420 miles southeast of Midway. The Astoria was mostly engaged in carrier escort missions in the months that followed. She took part in the battles of Midway and Coral Sea. After the carrier Yorktown was abandoned during the latter engagement, she briefly acted as Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's flagship. By the end of the summer, Captain William Garrett Greenman was in charge of the Astoria. Greenman had assumed command of the cruiser on June 14, 1942, at the age of 53. The crewmen on board the Astoria faced a demanding run of lengthy and challenging days in early August. The crew has been in an almost continual state of preparation since leaving Coral Island in the Fijis on July 31st. The Astoria was at the center of the 8-month-old war with Japan, in which the U.S. Navy was suddenly on the offensive. The Astoria had assisted in repelling 2 Japanese air raids and provided guard duty over the approaches to the landing zone since the Marines' landing on the morning of August 7th between Lunga Point on Guadalcanal and the smaller neighboring island of Tulagi. In the days ahead, more of the same routine was anticipated. The Astoria was part of a fire support group called Task Group 62.3 and served alongside her sister ships, the Vincennes and Quincy, during the first approach to Guadalcanal. The ships joined a broader screening group once their fire support job finished. The screening group's efforts focused on safeguarding the transport ships and were led by British Rear Admiral V.A. Crutchley on board the cruiser Australia. These were the ships that transported the Marines, supplies, and equipment that comprised the invading force, and they were positioned off the landing zone. The Guadalcanal operation's success depended on their survival. The cruisers established anti-aircraft positions near the transports during the day. The screening group protected the sea approaches to the landing zone in the evening from potential Japanese surface force attacks. Crutchley separated his screening force cruisers into 3 major groups to cover all potential points of entry into the area. The names of each group were initially derived from the formation's lead cruiser. The heavy cruisers, Australia, Canberra, and Chicago, composed the Australia Group, which patrolled to the south and east of Savo Island. Later, the group of cruisers from Australia was referred to as the South Group. In addition to the name ship, The Astoria and Quincy were part of the Vincennes Group, which was subsequently referred to as the North Group. This party traveled from east to west between Savo Island and Florida Island under the direction of Vincennes Captain Frederick L. Reef Cole. The light cruisers San Juan and Hobart covered the eastern approaches to the landing zone. Allied commanders considered the latter to be the least likely target for a Japanese surface strike. 2 destroyers screened each cruiser group, while picket destroyers armed with radar were positioned outside the approaches. The watch at night. Like the night before, the night of August 8th started off similarly. As part of the North Group of cruisers, the Astoria moved from her daytime anti-aircraft position into her pre-assigned evening patrol area at dusk. Approximately 600 yards directly behind the Quincy, she assumed her position as the final cruiser in the line. The lead cruiser, Vincennes, had the destroyer helm positioned 1,500 yards off its port bow. Off the starboard bow of the lead ship, the destroyer Wilson held a similar posture. The team walked around the edge of a box about 5 miles across. The gang cruised at a pace of 10 knots, turning 90 degrees in column to the right every 30 minutes. They made the necessary time and speed changes to complete the corner turns on time. Rain squalls over Savo Island started to gradually migrate southeast just before midnight, eventually settling between the patrolling cruisers from the north and south. The Astoria was in the second state of preparedness. The crew stood alternate 4-hour watches under this system, which is typically employed when there is a chance of a surprise attack. The cruiser had 3 8-inch main turrets, each with 2 guns manned. Despite not being primed, all 9 guns were loaded with rounds. There were rumors that enemy submarines were working nearby, so lookouts monitored the horizon for them. Captain Greenman knew that earlier in the day, around 400 miles away, a group of Japanese surface ships had been spotted near Bougainville Island. If and when the enemy surface ships entered the area, the picket destroyers or the cruisers from the south would undoubtedly sound an early alarm. As the clock struck midnight, Sunday, August 9th, 1942, a new day began. On board the Astoria, the midwatch from 12 to 4 a.m. had just started. Across the cruiser, men arriving on watch took their places. Before rotating back on duty, exhausted sailors leaving watch set out for a quick 4-hour siesta. Seaman second class. Norman Miller was one of the people leaving the watch. He took a brief shower below. He chose to go topside as he couldn't sleep in his bunk. The heat temperatures below deck made this not out of the ordinary. In the end, he lay down on several life jackets close to the 20mm cannons, which were situated directly above the third turret. Just before midnight, Lieutenant Commander J.R. Topper, the deck's supervisory officer, had started his shift on the bridge. After many minutes, Lieutenant J.G. N.A. In his capacity as officer of the deck, Berkey Jr. took over. Seaman Second Class Don Yeamans and Quartermaster Second Class Royal Rodkay were among the other sailors who took up their watch stations on the bridge. Yeamans has been a member of the quartermaster crew aboard the Astoria since June 1941. Rodkay would be the watch's chief quartermaster. Fully clothed, Captain Greenman withdrew to his emergency cabin, which was very next to the pilot house. Seaman First Class, Lynn Hager arrived for his sky control watch above the bridge. Tuning on the JV communications line, he put on his headset. Testing communications to the bridge was his first task. Everything seemed to be operating as it should. "Keep a sharp lookout on our own formation and all around," he was told from the bridge. He then proceeded to his observation position on the starboard side, beside the 1.1-inch gun director, adjusted his binoculars, and started scanning the horizon. Ralph Boone started his watch in the after-engine room, much below the main deck. Since May 1940, the machinist mate's second class had been on board the Astoria. He quickly went about his responsibilities of performing normal maintenance as he was familiar with the ship. Unaware that catastrophe was less than 2 hours away, the men on duty carried out their responsibilities in every part of the ship. Mikawa's audacious retaliation. Shortly after the Japanese learned of the American landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, the events that would bring about the men of the Astoria's demise started to take shape. The Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai sailed from Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, at around 2:30 p.m. on August 7th. Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the commander of the recently established 8th Fleet, was on board. Mikawa himself would spearhead a bold counterattack from the bridge of his flagship. Approximately 675 miles southeast of Rabaul, the daring plot aimed for a surprise nighttime attack on American vessels in the Guadalcanal region. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer made up Mikawa's formidable force. Before leaving the area by heading north between Florida and Savo Islands, the attack force would move east to target American vessels after entering the Guadalcanal area on the south side of Savo Island. The Japanese army would go south from Rabaul to the east of Bougainville before turning southeast through the Slot, a short path in the central Solomons that led straight to Guadalcanal. On its last approach to Guadalcanal, the force had moved northeast of New Georgia by the afternoon of August 8th. The Japanese advanced quickly on Savo Island after launching scout planes beforehand to reconnoiter the Guadalcanal region. Both the configuration of the ships and the approximate locations of the 2 Allied cruiser groups positioned near Savo Island were reported by the scout planes. On August 9th, just after 1 in the morning, the force went unnoticed by the USS Blue, a destroyer positioned northwest of Savo Island. As the Japanese ships passed through the South Passage around Savo and headed straight toward the South cruiser force, neither radar nor lookouts were able to detect them. Admiral Crutchley in Australia had already left the area by this point in order to attend an urgent commanders' meeting outside the landing zone. Unusual ships arriving in the harbor. The Japanese force unexpectedly approached and caught the unaware cruisers on patrol southeast of Savo Island in a chain of events that happened quickly after one another. The destroyer Patterson was one of the first American vessels to see the Japanese approaching. "Warning" was the first emergency message she sent over the talk between ships, TBS radio. "Caution, unusual ships coming into port." The time was 1:46 a.m. The cruisers Canberra and Chicago were illuminated almost instantly when Japanese float aircraft dropped brilliant flares near the ships off Lunga Point. Then the gunfire began. The Canberra swiftly became a raging conflagration after being struck 24 times in less than 5 minutes. The Japanese cruisers rushed past the Chicago, which was struck by a torpedo in the bows and was unable to make contact. Crutchley left the Chicago's Captain Howard Bode in command of the South Force, but he neglected to alert Captain Reef Cole on the Vincennes. Officer of the deck, Berkey of Astoria was acknowledging a course change from the Vincennes over TBS radio at about the same time as the Patterson's warning communication. The group of cruisers was a little behind schedule. Consequently, the warning message from the Patterson was not received. Lieutenant CMDR Topper believed he heard a distant underwater explosion a few minutes later. The noise was probably torpedoes from the Japanese engagement with the southern cruisers, but he thought it was a destroyer dropping depth charges. Without being informed, Captain Greenman slept in his emergency cabin. Underwater sounds were not unique to Lieutenant Topper. Machinist Mate Boone was inspecting the shaft lanes in the after engine room. To make sure the shafts were turning correctly, the task, which is regarded as standard maintenance, was completed. Abruptly, Boone heard odd sounds coming from the ocean. He quickly reported the noises to the chief machinist mate, who was in charge of the engine room, believing that there were issues with the shafts. He was immediately instructed to check the shafts once more by the chief. Seaman First Class. Hager noticed the distant sound of an airplane at sky control. Soon after, more lookouts reported hearing aircraft flying overhead. Hager informed the bridge of this information twice, the second time about 1:30 in the morning. The officer in charge of the 6-man watch at sky control, Lieutenant Arthur McLaughlin, gave the order for sky ahead and sky aft to maintain a vigilant watch. Topper hurried to the starboard side of the bridge as soon as he heard the reports of jets overhead. He listened carefully, but all he could hear were the blowers directly behind Turret 1. Then he proceeded to the pilot house's starboard glass and peered to the right and forward. The other ships in the formation appeared to be in perfect condition. The Allied formation was surprised. After a little while, the first sign that something was amiss emerged. From his position at sky control, Lynn Hager noticed a series of 4 or 5 flares. He calculated that the distance from the Astoria was 5,000 yards. The flares were removed from the Astoria's stern at a 180-degree relative bearing. Hager reported his sighting to the bridge, thinking the flares had been dropped by aircraft. The flares initially appeared to be hanging in the hazy atmosphere and not burning very well. However, the flares quickly started to light brightly after falling a short distance. Hager was instructed by Lieutenant McLaughlin to report to the bridge in order to sound the general quarters. Topper shouted for Berkey to summon the captain and stand by to sound general quarters around the time Hager's flare report reached the bridge. He then spotted a line of 4 aircraft flares approximately 5,000 yards off the port, quarter after running out the pilot house's portside door. It was approximately 1:50 a.m. As soon as the flares were spotted, the gunnery section acted. Just as a lookout reported seeing 3 Japanese cruisers, Lieutenant CMDR William Truesdell, the gunnery officer, noticed the flares. He asked the officer of the deck to sound the general quarters after ordering the loading of the remaining main battery guns. As Lieutenant J.G. Dante Marzita and his men hurriedly calculated a firing solution in the main battery plotting room, sighting information was already pouring in. It was estimated that the enemy cruisers were 5,500 yards away at a 315-degree target angle. As early as 1:47 a.m., the Japanese cruisers were aiming their guns at the American cruisers as they sped northwest into the Vincennes group. It was evident to lookouts on board the Chokaiko that the final ship in the American column, the Astoria, lacked battle position training for her main battery turrets. It seemed to the Japanese that the cruiser force from the north would be taken by surprise as well. The Chokai promptly turned on her searchlight after receiving the order to start fire at 1:50 a.m., lighting the Astoria from a distance of 7,800 yards. The first images. The initial main battery salvo fired by the Japanese flagship fell short and to the left from the Astoria's port bow in a matter of seconds. Other Japanese cruisers followed their flagship's example and fired at the Yorktown and Quincy. The second main battery salvo, fired by the Chokai, landed off the port side of the Astoria less than 2 minutes later. By this point, Gunnery Officer Truesdell had asked for authorization to start shooting. At approximately 1:53 a.m., he issued the order himself after receiving no response from the bridge. A barrage of 8 or 9 guns suddenly shook the Astoria. All of the shots that were aimed at the Chokai missed. At first, the important officers of the watch were not informed that enemy ships had been detected, which caused confusion on the Astoria's bridge. Topper had asked officer of the deck Berkey to call the captain, but Berkey had not done so because he was on the TBS with the Yorktown had acknowledged a planned course adjustment. Without being told to do so, Quartermaster Radke sounded the general quarters alarm as soon as he saw a ship in the distance begin to fire. Lieutenant J.G. John Mullen hurried to fetch Greenman after noticing that the captain, the junior officer of the deck, was not present. The ship was over 6,800 yards from the Astoria when the 4th main battery volley departed the Chokai at 1:53 in the morning. Although it missed by roughly 500 yards, the salvo's deflection was accurate. The number of the Astoria was almost in the hands of the Japanese gunners. The losing guns in the United States. Captain Greenman entered the pilot house as the main battery sounded the general alarm. He took note of the flares in the distance and the searchlight shining on his spacecraft, trying to make sense of the situation. "Who sounded the general alarm?" he asked Topper right away. "Who issued the directive to start firing?" Topper retorted that he hadn't issued either directive. Greenman ordered a ceasefire because he was worried that the Astoriawa was firing on friendly ships. As soon as possible, Truesdell alerted the bridge to his shooting against Japanese cruisers. The gunnery officer asked for immediate authorization to start shooting again. In the distance, Captain Greenman saw a salvo across the Vincennes. He witnessed the Chokai's 4th salvo miss the Astoria by less than a minute. He issued orders to start fire and sound the general quarters right away. In order to better position the Astoria in respect to the targets and avoid Quincy's firing line, Greenman then gave the order to accelerate to maximum speed and turned the ship slightly to port. Sailors scrambled across the Atlantic to their designated battle stations after hearing the general quarters alarm. On and around the bridge, men appeared to be running in all directions. Topper went to Central Station, while Royal Rodkey remained on the bridge as the senior quartermaster. With his headset set to the JV circuit, Don Yeaman stood on the port side Polaris, which is a long way out from the bridge. As the combat began, he watched the chaos on the bridge from his vantage position. Everyone was running around like the devil, he remembered, turning to face the sea. I saw something burning off in the distance. The blazing Canberra, whose men had already experienced what the crew of the Astoria was going to go through, was probably the source of the flames. Ensign Thomas Fernanding also hurried to his battle station on the bridge. Fernanding was the cruiser's signal officer aboard the Astoria for less than a year. The Chokai's 6th salvo struck the Astoria midships at approximately 1:55 in the morning, resulting in at least 4 direct hits with 8-inch armor-piercing shells. The strikes caused flames in the hangar area and on the boat deck. Immediately after being fully fueled for an early morning takeoff, the cruiser's seaplanes caught fire. Japanese gunners, who no longer need the assistance of searchlights, targeted the fires. The Astoria fired back with a volley of 6 guns. The shells, fired from the 2 forward turrets, missed their objective. The lead Japanese ship was no longer within range of the 2 forward turrets, which had now reached the port side limit of their turning radius. Turret 3, which had momentarily lost power, was now the only weapon the U.S. cruiser could use to return fire. Later, a turn would move the firing to the starboard side and fix the situation. Turret 1 was struck 3 times shortly after the Astoria fired her salvo. 2 of the shells struck the barbette, and 1 pierced the faceplate, probably from the same 8-inch salvo. Every person inside the barbette and turret was killed. The cruiser's sole turret, number 2, was able to fire its 2 guns after another turn. All that stood between us was a steel wall. As more Japanese cruisers aimed their guns at the Astoria, she came under intense concentrated fire. The Astoriawas were repeatedly struck by large and small shells over a 6-minute period starting at 2 in the morning. A hit overhead covered the front engine room, with smoke during the onslaught, forcing it to be abandoned. All of the people inside the top fire room were killed when it was struck. The water supply required to combat the now raging fires amidships was cut off when the main fire risers were broken. On the port side, an 8-inch shell struck the ready service ammo box, blew a huge hole in the deck, and penetrated the protective screen surrounding the number 8 5-inch secondary cannon. At this point, the hangar area fire was out of control. Eventually, most of the crews of the secondary 5-inch batteries were killed at their fighting stations, and most of them became silent. William Guy Eaton, navigator of the Astoria, was killed when the chart house was directly hit by the barrage of gunfire. The lieutenant commander, 42, was probably slain at once. Chief Quartermaster Leo Brom was also killed in the same explosion. Don Yeamans was standing at the portside Polaris when the shell struck, at just within his position. He recalled, "There was just a steel wall between us." His eardrums were ruptured, and he was knocked off his feet by the blast's ferocity. The next thing he knew, 2 sailors were asking him if he was all right as they helped him off the deck. Handling firefight casualties. Ralph Boone never finished his regular upkeep. General quarters sounded just as he was about to begin his second examination of the shaft lanes. As he hurried to his combat station, Boone said, "I grabbed my flashlight and life jacket." He would join a repair party that met in the mess hall during general quarters. The after engine room was directly above the room. A Japanese shell struck the mess hall shortly after he got on station. It sparked a fire and a massive explosion. Although Boone was unharmed, those around him were not. Another friend who is a machinist, A.L. McCann, suffered severe injuries to his ankle and foot. Boone beckoned for a first aid supply. Ensign Hugh Davis showed up right away holding one. Boone recounted, "I was about to apply a tourniquet when another shell struck close by and destroyed the first aid kit. Boone chose to transport the injured soldier to the post-battle dressing area so he could get better care. Water tender. Second Class W.T. Duffy, who had been on the JV phone, stopped him as he was passing past the crew quarters. The post-battle dressing area had been struck and was on fire, Duffy told Boone. Boone placed McCann down gently in a bunk bed, unsure of what to do next. He never saw the injured man again after being called in to help repair a shell hole 1 deck below. Seaman Second Class Miller had suffered severe injuries to both legs while he was positioned above the hangar. The combat began just as he was ready to nod off. He was roped down to the top of turret number 3 in order to get out of his dangerous position. He was forced off the turret and onto the main deck shortly after. He was lowered into the ocean on a rope while wearing a life jacket. He was eventually rescued by a warship after being hauled onto a life raft. The Astoria's final shots. On board the Astoria, things are becoming worse. A gruesome scene was being repeated all over the wrecked ship. Men with injuries were fighting for their lives. Some had lost limbs, while others had suffered severe burns. Blood was all over the deck. Both steering and engines were still under the bridge staff's control. The central station was thought to be intact, and communications links were still open. No significant fires below the main deck were detected, but Turret 1 was out. The majority of the secondary gun batteries had been silenced, and the ship was burning amidships. Around this time, the captain was informed by the engineering officer that the ship was experiencing severe boiler room problems and the power was starting to go out. At this point, gunfire, most likely from the heavy cruiser Kako, ripped across the starboard side of the Astoria's bridge. Quartermaster First Class Houston Williams, the helmsman, was one of the bridge crew members who perished. Despite suffering shrapnel wounds as well, Boatswain's Mate First Class Julian Young managed to stand up and take the wheel. At that moment, a mass of flames called the Quincy emerged from the port bow. The ships looked as if they might crash into each other. A strong turn to port was ordered by Captain Greenman. The Astoria passed safely astern of her sister ship after Young threw the wheel to the left. Ensign Fernanding had also suffered severe injuries to his right leg and heel from the gunfire. He would remember the incident saying, "I went to stand up and collapsed." Fernanding had been on the starboard side, just inside the pilot's cabin. Walter Putman, a yeoman second class, gave him a cigarette and supported him against the bulkhead. Quartermaster Rodkey did his best to tend to the injured, following the attack on the chart house. He was immediately instructed by the captain's orderly to take Young's place at the helm. The mate of the injured boatswain was on the verge of passing out. To continue the zigzag motions the captain had been directing, someone had to be in charge of the wheel. When Rodkey got behind the wheel, he found that steering control was gone. The central station took over the steering right away. The Astoria is now traveling at 7 knots. The ship was once again illuminated by a searchlight, so Turret 2 trained out to the port side to shoot at it. The Japanese ship Kinugasa was probably the light's source. The turret fired under local control since the main fire control system was not operational. The Astoria would fire these final bullets. The salvo struck the Chokai's number 1 turret directly. However, it missed the Kinugasa. Before long, the searchlight was out. Now, the enemy fire started to fade. The conflict finally seemed to have moved past the Astoria. Evaluating the damage. The situation was getting worse at sky control above the bridge as enemy gunfire took a significant toll. "Get those damn searchlights," was the final command Lynn Hager had gotten from the bridge over the JV channel before the communication circuit died. Men up on the sky control kept dropping, Hager later recounted. They were dispersed over the decks. An officer reported that the sick bay had been destroyed after leaving the position to attempt to transport some injured soldiers there. Hager removed his pointless headphones and started helping the injured. He descended to the communication deck, while sky control was evacuated. The Astoria lost power went out at around 2:15 a.m. Lieutenant CMDR's Truesdell entered the pilot house shortly after, having descended from the director high above, and told the captain that the ammunition cutting room right above the bridge was on fire. He suggested abandoning the bridge since ammo was already beginning to detonate. The whole ship aft of the main mast seemed to be a mass of flames to those still on the bridge. Greenman didn't take long to order the bridge area to be abandoned. He communicated that all men, both healthy and injured, were to gather at the forecastle, which is located close to the ship's bow. The captain personally positioned himself directly in front of Turret 2 on the communication deck. Truesdell remained to oversee the wounded people's removal from the bridge location. He made sure everyone was out by searching the top levels. The physically fit made every effort to assist the injured in getting down. A rope was attached around Ensign Fernanding, who was unable to escape on his own and was lowered to safety. After descending a ladder, Don Yeamans headed for the ship's bow. It felt like everything was burning. About 400 sailors, many of them injured, had gathered close to the forecastle by 3 a.m. Captain Greenman started compiling information on his ship's condition. There didn't seem to be any significant fires below the second deck. It was believed that the engine rooms were waterproof. For some reason, the ship was 3 degrees to port. The after part of the ship was inaccessible due to large fires at the boat deck, secondary gun batteries, and well deck. It was unknown how things were at the stern. Abandoned ship. A bucket brigade was formed to combat the fires after all of the water mains burst. The fires amidships were hoped to be extinguished. Despite their best efforts, sailors were unable to put out the flames. A plan to treat the injured there had to be shelved since the decks close to the captain's cabin got so heated. Before long, Captain Greenman was worried about the front magazines. He had flooded the 5-inch and 8-inch magazines. The 8-inch magazine seems to have been successfully flooded, but the effectiveness of the flooding of the 5-inch magazine was called into question by explosions heard nearby. It worried the captain more and more that the 5-inch magazine would explode. Yeamans could feel the heat rising from the main deck as he descended from the bridge. Although he was aware that he was close to one of the magazines, he was unsure if it had been flooded. He jumped over the side as soon as he believed he heard someone shout, "Abandon ship!" As it happened, no such order had been issued. After 3 or 4 hours in the ocean, he was rescued by the destroyer Bagley. The skipper made the decision to leave the stranded ship at approximately 4:45 in the morning. Blinker asked the Bagley to approach the starboard bow of the Astoria. The destroyer maneuvered into position, pushing her bow all the way to the cruiser's side. To create a crossing, wooden planks, typically used for painting the ship's side, were positioned. Able-bodied people started to depart the Astoria after the injured were securely moved to the destroyer. A flashing light was visible close to the Astoria's stern as the Bagley moved away. Contrary to first assumptions, the cruiser's after section did not seem to be on fire. After acknowledging the signal, the destroyer focused on rescuing survivors who were dispersed around the ocean. Attempting to preserve the Astoria, the cruiser's executive officer, Commander Frank Shoup, had ordered survivors to gather close to the ship's stern. Fires had been so bad that Commander Shoup had had to leave his station. Near the fantail, about 150 men gathered, including about 30 injured. Although the Turret 3 was without power, the 1.1-inch machine gun stations on the main deck close to the stern were still manned. The men aft could see fierce flames in the distance. They thought the whole forward section of the ship was on fire. Shoup gave the order to evacuate the injured. In pursuit of a destroyer, 4 life rafts loaded with the most critical patients departed from the Astoria's stern. The Wilson later picked them up. A bucket brigade was then organized by Commander Shoup. At the hangar's starboard door, the team got to work. They tried to put out the fire with buckets and 8-inch powder cans. Around 3 in the morning, a light rain started to fall, which helped their efforts. An hour or so later, the sound of a gas-powered pump could be heard someplace close to the ship's forward section. The bucket brigade made its way onto the well deck between 4:30 and 5 a.m., but an oil fire ultimately halted their advance. At that point, the Bagley was spotted leaving close to the Astoria's bow and was identified by a flashlight. After assessing the issue, Shoup and Lieutenant CMDR John Hayes, the chief engineer, reached the same conclusion. It was possible to save the Astoria. It seemed likely to them that the cruiser might even be able to start up on her own. The Bagley came up near the Astoria shortly after dawn. On the cruiser's port side, a number of shell holes were seen just above the waterline. Soon after, Captain Greenman returned to his stranded ship. "I think we can save her," said Commander Shoup to the captain, and Greenman instantly came up with a strategy. A salvage crew of roughly 325 men started working to save the Astoria after more injured were removed from the cruiser. The majority of the crew was made up of signalmen, engineers, and other experts. The majority of the cops took part as well. Just after 6 in the morning, the Bagley set out to move the last survivors to a transport. Soon, the Astoria's rescue mission will be fully underway. To keep fighting the fire, 3 firefighting parties were formed. The gruesome duty of gathering corpses and getting them ready for burial at sea fell to another group. the ship's damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Topper, organized a party below decks to assess the damage below the waterline. On the starboard side, a 5-inch shell hole was discovered. It looked to be holding after being plugged. A number of little fires were discovered and put out. It looked as though the after magazines had been adequately soaked. All watertight hatches and openings on the second deck and below were secured by the gang. Additionally, engineers descended to inspect the different engine and fire rooms. Due to heat from surrounding fires or debris, some of the chambers turned out to be inaccessible. Hayes, the engineering officer, decided that he could try to produce steam from fire room number 4 alone. All electrical battery power was discovered to be gone, with the middle batteries near the well deck destroyed and the forward and after batteries depleted. Detonations below deck. The minesweeper. Hopkins arrived to offer help at around 7 a.m. To help in the firefighting effort, the cruiser received a gas-powered pump and hose from an old destroyer that had been converted into a minesweeper. In the hopes that it could be spliced into the Astoria's system, a power wire was also passed over. Captain Greenman believed that bringing the Astoria into the shallow waters close to Guadalcanal would be the best opportunity to save her. He asked to have his cruiser towed away. In order to pass a tow rope between the ships, the Hopkins backed her stern up to the back of the cruiser. After 2 tries, the Astoria was soon in tow. In the end, the Hopkins managed to tie 3 knots. At around 9 in the morning, the destroyer Wilson arrived on the scene. She quickly started pumping water into the fires after positioning herself off the starboard bow of the Astoria. For nearly an hour, the stream went on. The Wilson and Hopkins were summoned away at around 10 in the morning. Soon after, Captain Greenman received word that the destroyer Buchanan would be arriving to carry up the firefight. Additionally, the transport Alcibawa was sent to join the tow line. The fires below were getting hotter, although there had been some improvement on the flames above deck. In the wardroom area, a big fire was raging out of control. Below decks, there were a number of minor explosions before a much bigger one at 11 a.m. The bigger blast seemed to have come from right behind and beneath turret 2. First to 10 degrees, then to 15 degrees, the Astoria's list to port started to rise. Once barely above the waterline, the holes were now absorbing water. Mattresses and pillows were used in an unsuccessful attempt to plug them. The noise of another internal explosion reached Lieutenant Commander Topper as he stood on the forecastle. He saw yellow bubbles rising to the surface close to turret 2 as he peered over the port side. He hurried to alert the captain of this knowledge after giving the order for all staff to vacate the area. Now stationed off the cruiser's starboard bow, the Buchanan was ready to continue fighting the fire. Captain Greenman moved forward for an up-close look at the work. Now, the cruiser's list was growing quickly. To talk about the situation, the senior officers convened. Topper, Engineering Officer Hayes, and Executive Officer Shoup all believed it was time to leave the ship once more. Captain Greenman agreed without hesitation. In order to take off troops, the Buchanan tow was prepared to move to the starboard quarter. The order was for all hands to move toward the ship's stern. The Astoria's list had reached 30 degrees before Captain Greenman and his officers could reach the fantail. It became clear that the cruiser would not be able to survive for long. Captain Greenman ordered the ship to abandon at midday. While the Buchanan stood around 300 yards away, men started to leap into the ocean. The list had grown to 45 degrees as Greenman and Shoup made their final exit from the ship. The Astoria started to sink stern first after turning to her port beam. At 12:15, she vanished, her bow rising just above the water. Winning Guadalcanal, losing the Astoria. One of many casualties sustained during the Battle of Savo Island, which was arguably the most total defeat of a military force in American history. Despite this, the USS Astoria was a brave ship whose crew worked long hours to save her. But the loss of 3 American heavy cruisers and 1 Australian off Savo Island was not in vain. The lengthy road to victory in the Pacific took a significant stride forward when the island of Guadalcanal was seized 7 months later. The Clatsop County, Oregon, Board of Commissioners unanimously adopted a resolution on July 27, 2005, designating August 9th as USS Astoria Day. The major city in Clatsop County is Astoria, which is situated in the northwest region of the state. The proclamation is a modest but enduring homage.